Great. Well, hello, my name's Neil Lee. I'm a professor of economic geography at the LSE and convener of the Cities, Jobs and Economic Change research theme in the Inequalities Institute. It's a great place to welcome you today to this seminar. We have a really interesting speaker speaking on a topic which I think is very topical and very important. So we have Mike Lenz from UCLA, who's Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy and Associate Faculty Director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies in the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. And Mike's been here in LSE for a year, and he's been essentially doing two things, working on two big projects, one of which is a book, which we're going to be hearing about today. And the other part is he's been watching Arsenal at the football club. And personally, I'd like to wish him, great success in at least one of these two things he's working on, and maybe not the other. So Mike's going to be talking for about 45 minutes on his study on the evolution of Black neighborhoods in the United States from 1970 to 2020. We're very pleased to welcome him. Mike, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much for that, Neil, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. And thank you to everybody in front and behind the scenes at LSE and International Inequalities Institute, and for the community more broadly for hosting me during this academic year. Of course, we haven't all seen a lot of each other or enough of each other over this academic year, but I have been very privileged and fortunate to benefit from LSE in my time in the UK. I'm a little bit rusty on presenting and Zooming these days, but this is by the same token, it's a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about what I've been working on when not watching Arsenal win or lose. And that is this book that I'm working on about Black neighborhoods in the United States. And I'll get right into why I'm working on this right now. And so the purpose of my book is to quantitatively summarize the characteristics of Black neighborhoods in the US from 1970 to 2020. And I'll talk a little bit about why I'm choosing that time frame from 1970 to the roughly present. And that encapsulates roughly 3,000 to 7,000 neighborhoods, depending on the year that I'm looking at these data. And it's a minority of the neighborhoods in the United States. If you just look at census tracts, which I'll define in a minute, like there's roughly 65,000 of them in the United States. So this is a piece of the urban puzzle, but I would argue a very important one. My goal is to summarize them in time, but also discuss how the neighborhoods evolve and look at heterogeneity across space, so variation across time and space. And the latter two things on this list here, I'm certainly not as far along on, but we'll preview a little bit of it, where I'm looking at some reasons why different neighborhoods in different places change in different ways, and also eventually looking at some potential effects of this change and of these neighborhoods on particular individuals that move in and out of them. So just to start kind of framing like where the research on this and where I fit is there's roughly three types of studies on Black neighborhoods in the United States. And I'll try to talk a little bit about race more broadly than just saying I'm studying Black neighborhoods. I'll give you a little bit more on why. But for now, thinking through what exists, there's this kind of huge area of research that we call segregation research, or research on segregation. This is a lot of sociology, some public policy, economics. To me, Black neighborhoods are kind of implicit characters in this story about segregation, where we look at how separate people live, how people of different incomes and races do or do not live in the same neighborhoods, or how far apart they live, or how infrequent it is where you might come into contact with somebody of a different race in your neighborhood. Again, the actual neighborhoods and people living in Black neighborhoods are often kind of, I think, implicit characters or background characters. And this research, like mine, is also mostly quantitative, looking at, again, measurement and prevalence and then causes and consequences. Really honing in on the consequences is the second piece, which is the neighborhood effects literature. So again, a lot of sociology here, a lot of housing policy dominated in the United States by this experiment that we ran in the 90s and 2000s called the Moving to Opportunity Study, where we gave low-income households living in what we call public housing or council housing here, giving them vouchers to live in lower poverty neighborhoods and studying kind of what happens. So again, trying to isolate, like, what are the consequences of these segregated living environments that are so prevalent in the United States. Again, to me, the Black neighborhood is kind of an implicit character or a background character. A low poverty neighborhood is obviously a little bit more explicit in that study, in those studies. And then the existing research that really centers Black neighborhoods as places are neighborhood ethnographies. So qualitative studies of particular neighborhoods at a particular point in time. And there's a rich history of this work, but they are not able to kind of capture more than one place in one time. So then I think it's probably helpful for people who didn't necessarily grow up in the United States or spend a whole lot of time there to talk about the Great Migration and the formation of Black neighborhoods in the US. So from 1900 to 1970, roughly 6 million Blacks moved to virtually all white northern cities from the rural South. This is what we call the Great Migration. And 6 million is, of course, a bit of an underestimate because those people had children and those people had children. And so these numbers grew quite dramatically. These individuals also moved in large numbers to southern US cities, which is something that I think is covered in the literature. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of rise of southern cities and how that affects the story. The Blacks who moved to urban America while urban America was urbanizing quite a lot, or while America was urbanizing quite rapidly, faced discrimination in every area. So, housing discrimination, employment discrimination. In the South, of course, voting rights were hard fought and won in the 1960s. Schooling, of course, was separate in a lot of places as well. And the Great Migration and the discriminatory responses to it led to the formation of Black ghettos, most famously in northern industrial cities such as Detroit, Chicago, and New York. Why do I begin the story in 1970? 1970 in many ways is kind of an inflection point in this story, both in Black America more broadly, but specifically in urban Black America and Black neighborhoods. So after decades of discrimination in housing and employment and some of the failed promises of the civil rights movement, we have deeply segregated cities for the most part, and a devaluation of Black neighborhoods and Black spaces. We have an end to the Great Migration around this period that really leads to collapsed housing demand in Black neighborhoods, and then persistent underemployment in our segregated fabric, a growing drug trade, and enforcement around that, often involving police brutality. That's not a new problem in the United States, but it might be more aware. People may be more aware of it these days. Led to riots in the short term, lots of riots in particularly northern US cities in the late 1960s. But over the long term, this was coupled with extreme levels of disadvantage. At this point, we also have rapidly increasing immigration from Mexico, Central America, and various countries in Asia, really changing the racial demographics and form of US cities. So that's a lot of kind of the negative, a fast, sprint through a lot of the negative stuff. On the other hand, we have freedom of movement for Black Americans in US cities like never before. A lot of we had the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that makes housing discrimination on the books illegal. Of course, more affirmatively integrating places is still an ongoing problem. But more freedom of movement and a growing Black middle class that really kind of changes in some ways concentrates poverty and race in particular areas, but also makes this 1970 inflection point a little bit more real. So I talked about this as a very quantitative study, looking at a lot of different places and a bunch of different times. And so how do I do this? In the United States, we often proxy neighborhoods with something that we call a census tract, where the U.S. Census Bureau chops up cities into plots of land that we gather data from, and we can exploit that data and use that data and measure various indicators. I focus a lot, at least in this book and in this talk, on education, poverty, income, and unemployment. Kind of the obvious demographic questions and socioeconomic characteristics of these neighborhoods. I define a Black neighborhood as one where Blacks are the largest racial or ethnic group. And I'll get a little bit into how we kind of measure race in the United States, which is different than most other countries as well. And the thing about the history of race and segregation in the United States is that where Blacks are usually the largest racial or ethnic group, they're also a majority. So it's kind of synonymous. So in 2017, 80% of Black neighborhoods, if you measure them as a plurality, are also a majority. So some of the kind of distinction of like how you determine that threshold is a little bit not that important. So I've got 152 metropolitan areas at 6 different points in time. But it is important to note that Black neighborhoods are very concentrated in the United States. So we have we don't have a metropolitan area that is as big as London in terms of like how much it eats up the country's population. But still, the biggest cities such as New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles have very large numbers of people and a lot of Black neighborhoods. The concentration in kind of the original Black enclaves of the North and the West is certainly diffusing across the country. And I'll talk a little bit about this large and growing presence in the South in particular, and a huge decline in the West in the number of Black neighborhoods. So a preview of where what I have so far, distilled into as few bullets as I could do it. Many Black neighborhoods indicators are improving and converging with non-Black neighborhoods. So there is a steady improvement in indicators in Black neighborhoods, particularly as you contrast them with non-Black neighborhoods, but sizable gaps absolutely remain. There's substantial diversity within Black neighborhoods too. So I think, much of the literature, I think, focuses on the very disadvantaged Black neighborhoods. There's a much smaller neighborhood that focuses on Black middle-class spaces. But there is a great diversity both across the country and within and between metropolitan areas. As I just mentioned, Black neighborhoods are virtually disappearing in the American West, and I'll talk a little bit about the regional story and try to make some sense to that for people who don't spend as much time in the United States as I do. Prior research, as I noted, does not focus very much on the American South, but this is where the largest number of Black neighborhoods actually are, and where their number is growing the fastest, and where there's some promising indicators, particularly as we go to the next bullet, in places like Atlanta and Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., not exactly the South, but Atlanta very much is. And these are places with very large enclaves of Black middle-class neighborhoods with very strong indicators across socioeconomic characteristics. Anytime we talk about race and neighborhoods and neighborhood change, we often bring up the topic and issue of gentrification. This is something that is still relatively rare in Black neighborhoods, but some of the disappearance of Black neighborhoods is absolutely tied to some of the things that we would call gentrification: rising incomes, rising educational levels, greater racial diversity, and high rents and home values. And so, some of the story about disappearing Black neighborhoods is absolutely related to stories of gentrification. So just to start off with some of the basic levels and trends and some of the data that I've been swimming in for a couple of years. So starting off, I don't know how well this is coming across, but just to situate us kind of spatially and geographically in the United States, I'm going to talk a fair amount about 4 regions of the country. The West is, you should think of kind of California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. As we move east away from the West Coast on these maps, we see that there are not a lot of Black neighborhoods in the kind of mountain west, the mountain regions. Well, there's not a lot of neighborhoods. There's not a lot of cities. There's not a lot of population in that part of the country. And so as we continue to go east, we see large concentrations of people and Black neighborhoods in places like Dallas and Houston in the South, and then Georgia as we continue to move through the Southeast, and Florida. And then the kind of centers of the Great Migration northward were places like Chicago and Detroit and New York, Washington, D.C., that have kind of very large circles around them because there's a very large number of Black neighborhoods. So thinking about the West Coast, you're thinking about places like Los Angeles. The South is Atlanta. The Northeast is like New York and Boston. And the Midwest is places like Chicago and Detroit. I don't know how much of a geography lesson everybody on this Zoom needs, but I hope it's useful. So I've hinted at some of these regional concentrations, and the largest number of Black neighborhoods are typically found in the population centers in the northern and midwestern portions of the country, but the most concentrated Black populations, and therefore the largest number of Black neighborhoods, have always been in the South, and now this is a place where Black neighborhoods are kind of growing the fastest. So some basics on poverty, which I probably focus on poverty rates and related issues more than anything. If you look back at 1970, 1980, at the beginning of this story, the average Black neighborhood was 3 times as impoverished as non-Black neighborhoods in the country. By 2010, the ratio was 2 to 1. So that's kind of the simplest way I can, make a case that there are some converging indicators here, and I think it's, pretty important top line thing to take away. Some of that is, rising poverty rates outside of Black neighborhoods. So you see it goes from 9% to 12% over that time period, and some of that has I think some would argue, some demographers might argue that has something to do with the fact that non-Black neighborhoods are more non-white than they used to. So lots of immigration from, again, Mexico, Central America, and Asia, and creating neighborhoods that may still actually be racially segregated in some ways, right? And still are relatively disadvantaged in some ways. So, that's part of the story of where race and class kind of collide in the United States. This convergence in poverty is not, for some reason, showing up in median income. And so, I think, one way to think of this is that, there's a limit to the extent that kind of the Black middle class or upper class is kind of growing in the United States. Being lifted out of poverty is to a certain extent, but not, rising incomes across the board. So this is where I think I should introduce a little bit about how we classify people racially in the United States. And I'm going to go as simple as I can, and also try to offend as little as I would not want to. So identifying race and ethnicity and kind of consistently tabulating the presence of people of different racial and ethnic groups is always difficult. I can't really get into how we do this in every way in the United States, but just kind of thinking for our purposes, we generally put people into 4 to 5 categories, including like an other bucket. So, we've got white, Black, Hispanic or Latino, which are generally people from people from or their ancestors are from Mexico, Central America, South America, and then I would say our biggest catch-all category would be Asian, right? Big continent, the biggest one, in fact. And we lump people from, China or their ancestors are from China, India, their ancestors are from India. That's a big umbrella, and it's not very precise. And then the fifth category, again, is kind of everybody else, multiracial people like me, Native Americans, and a host of other folks who do not identify as any of those other four. So with that aside, there is quite a lot of racial transition, racial change or difference in what a Black neighborhood looked like in 1970 or 1980 versus now. First of all, the United States Census, our big data collecting body, did not ask people if they identified as Hispanic or Latino until 1980. So that's where the NA or not available comes in 1970. But that's kind of the biggest source of racial, well, the two biggest sources of racial change in a cross-section of Black neighborhoods then versus now is a much smaller share are Black in that neighborhood and a significantly higher share are Hispanic. So, a lot of times that goes hand in hand, particularly in the West and other kind of immigrant destinations like Chicago. But that's kind of the biggest story there, along with kind of a stable white population, although whites make up a much smaller share of the overall population than they did in 1970 in any metropolitan area, or most metropolitan areas. Educational attainment. This is another area of convergence, with a small caveat. I'm looking at with less than a high school degree, so what you might call a high school dropout. And then in the gray and the yellow, people with a college degree or a bachelor's or more. Still Black neighborhoods have higher dropout rates and lower BA attainment rates than non-Black neighborhoods, which is not a surprise, but a very clear convergence along with just a massive drop in the share of high school dropouts. This convergence is not really the case for the percent with a BA or more. So you see that in the most recent thing that I'm looking at in 2017, there's actually a wider gap in percent with a BA or more versus in 1970. I've created one way to kind of look at multiple socioeconomic characteristics at once is I created a disadvantage index based on 5 variables. So this is the share of adults with less than a high school degree, the poverty rate, the unemployment rate, share of female-headed households, and the median household income. How did I combine these things? Created a bunch of z-scores, averaged them together. So this is basically looking at the standard deviation, more disadvantaged you are, how many standard deviations you are from the average neighborhood in the country. And so if you look at non-Black tracts, they're always hovering around 0, slightly more advantaged than average when you pull out the Black neighborhoods, which are always more disadvantaged than average. So in 1970, the average Black neighborhood was 1.4 standard deviations more disadvantaged than the average tract in the country. That's down to 0.8 standard deviations by 2017. So again, substantial convergence, but still a sizable gap. I'm a housing researcher as well most of the time, and so I do like talking about housing and housing markets, and housing, of course, is not just important for affordability issues, or building housing is not just important for affordability issues, but this convergence that I'm going to try to walk you through on this slide has important implications for the extent to which people are likely to kind of demand, housing in Black neighborhoods as much as they do outside of it. So as I mentioned, like a big issue in, at this kind of inflection point in 1970 is we had a, huge drop in housing demand, low housing investment in Black neighborhoods. And part of that story is that Black neighborhoods have been, well, they were redlined, and so it wasn't easy to get mortgages. Neighborhoods have always been older on average, because that was where people segregated them into. And what we see here is that we're not building much housing anywhere, and the share of housing units that are kind of older than 30 years, that are built in the last 10 years, is starting to converge between Black and non-Black neighborhoods. And so if we think about the age of a neighborhood having a lot to do with the extent to which people are likely to want to live there or be or invest there, this is something to kind of keep an eye on for later. Rents are rising everywhere in U.S. cities, just like London, and this is this is something that we're seeing that it certainly relates to this limited housing supply and construction, but is not the entire story. And it's always been more expensive to live in disadvantaged neighborhoods as a renter than a homeowner. And that's also kind of what we see here as well. Home values are higher everywhere, but Black neighborhoods are rebounding very slowly from the Great Recession. So in some ways, Black neighborhoods continue to kind of produce, overly expensive housing options for renters and not particularly great investments for owners, which is, kind of the exact opposite as you'd want it as a resident of these neighborhoods. Okay, so that's kind of me wrestling 60 years of data into or 50 years of data into a I hope, coherent story. Let's talk a little bit more about kind of where and leading into kind of why some Black neighborhoods are and are not thriving. So the one easy way to look at this is regionally. Again, we have these 4 regions that it's a very big country and there's a lot of heterogeneity within regions, but this is a good way to try to wrestle things at the outset. And there's also a lot of kind of consistency within these regions that's important to highlight. So Black neighborhoods had the lowest poverty in the West, such as California. And so that's great news. And, I live in California and I think others should live in California too. It's really nice. I do really love London. I'll miss it. But Black neighborhoods are also disappearing in the West. So Black neighborhoods, Western Black neighborhoods made up roughly 12% of the total in 1970 and have declined to roughly 2% of the total. A lot of that is a Los Angeles story, but it's that's just kind of the biggest animal, where the same trends are replicated in places like Seattle, Portland, and to a large number in the San Francisco and Oakland area. Digging kind of deeper into some of the particular metros where things look good and bad. So starting with the bad, the Black neighborhood poverty rate in the Buffalo metropolitan area and a neighboring upstate New York metro in Rochester is 36%. That's extremely high, right? That's almost 3 times the national average. And so there is, I guess, the most coherent story is that things are rough in, as I mentioned, aging Midwestern, Northeastern metros. The Northeastern metros, there's kind of a big dichotomy between the smaller upstate New York, Pennsylvania metros and places on the other hand, like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, where Black neighborhood characteristics are pretty good and pretty good relative to non-Black neighborhoods. A lot of people, who study this sort of thing wouldn't be surprised to see places like Detroit and Cleveland on here, but they might be surprised about a place like Rochester or Albany, which are not kind of the typical stories about declining industrial areas. There's kind of the quick story for looking regionally here is this is Midwest in blue, South in orange. These are poverty rates. And so if you kind of just look quickly at 1970 and 2017, you see this flip between the Midwest and the South, where in 1970, Black neighborhoods in the South were very impoverished. That has improved markedly. A lot of that improvement is actually from DC and Atlanta, but also quite a few very strongly performing metros in North Carolina, like Charlotte and Raleigh. So here's some of those metros more specifically, kind of where things are going well, right? So the upside here is that in metros with the lowest Black neighborhood poverty rates, those rates are, the upside is like, you got a place like Washington, D.C. with a 14% poverty rate and, hundreds of Black neighborhoods. It's, I think 4th or 5th in the country in terms of the number of Black neighborhoods. But those poverty rates are as high or higher than the national average. So like even where Black neighborhoods are doing really, really well, they're doing like no better than the average neighborhood in the country. But a lot of neighborhoods here in this list, or a lot of metros in this list are in the South. And that seems to be kind of a success story to kind of latch onto, I think, if you're looking for hope. And I'm looking for hope. Hope is good. So I've certainly stolen the phrase Black Mecca from several others who have written books and other things on Atlanta, which has been known as Black Mecca for a number of decades. I'm lumping Washington, D.C. into this, and also, giving Washington, D.C. a little bit of a simplified story as a southern metro because, it was it definitely was on the side of the North in the Civil War, being that it was the seat of the American government and still is. But it's it is very remarkable to see the kind of decline in poverty in Black neighborhoods in DC and Atlanta. And both of these neighborhoods have kind of a unique story about the development of the Black middle class in these cities. So much so that I'm writing kind of a separate chapter on these two cities to try to unpack a little bit more about this history and the present. DC has a very large suburban Black middle class enclave in surrounding Maryland. Atlanta is home to several historically Black universities, was the center of the civil rights movement, and has a long history of Black entrepreneurship and actually great, relative racial progressivism in the service of kind of business and economic growth more broadly. So there's a lot of interesting stories about those two cities in particular. Of course, what you also, if you look at something hopeful, but you want to think about the potential downside, thinking about Washington, D.C. in particular, which is the rising home values in blue here. The question is, kind of, can Black people remain in the neighborhoods where they are in the face of rising rents and rising home prices? Rising home prices, hopefully a lot of those households are able to kind of cash in on that, right? But home ownership rates are, usually, depending on the metropolitan area, 20–25% lower for Black households than white households. And so the fact is that most people are renters in these neighborhoods, and therefore rising pressures on rents and home prices are not always such a good thing. So broadly speaking, kind of what I feel pretty strongly about it in terms of conclusions and takeaways about where and why Black neighborhoods are thriving compared to other neighborhoods in surrounding metros, is that a strong metropolitan economy is absolutely vital for Black neighborhoods. And it's not just that, a rising tide lifts all boats, or that, that like, places with strong economies have strong economic indicators. It's like places with strong economies have lower gaps between Black and non-Black neighborhoods. And so if you look at where at declining economies, there's very large gaps between Black and non-Black neighborhoods. If you look at places with strong economies, it's the opposite story. And I think that's also, a related pattern in kind of the, mega regions of the United States, like Washington and New York and Los Angeles, Atlanta. Places with very, very large, metropolitan populations are places where these gaps are the lowest. And then, certainly, again, like diversity and convergence with non-Black neighborhoods is kind of the theme of the last 50 years, but only to a point. If you look at the most advantaged Black neighborhoods in the United States, those are basically middle-class neighborhoods by any other standard. And the most disadvantaged non-Black neighborhoods are, roughly par with those neighborhoods, or pretty similar, right? They're also basically middle class. And the least disadvantaged, the least advantaged Black neighborhoods are in very, very bad shape. And that's not, new news to people who study this sort of thing. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about as I speed to the end here is to what extent, if we kind of look at neighborhoods as a consistent group and follow them over time, are we looking more often at kind of in terms of the positive stuff that we're seeing? Are we looking at more gentrifying trends? Or are we looking at a growing Black middle class that is brewing in the United States? And I will, just throw it to this cute little girl, and she will tell us why not both. And I think that's largely the conclusion, which may not be satisfying, but it's true. So I think, I'll speed through this very quickly, but I think, as people worry about gentrification in a lot of places, they have to kind of answer the question, like, why or is demand rising in particular neighborhoods? And there's some indicators blowing in both directions. So I think there are some fundamentals that are pushing up demand for living in Black neighborhoods. Higher income households are increasingly preferring central city locations in places that were racially segregated. But the overwhelming typical condition for Black neighborhoods is a lack of demand and investment, and not too much. And in the United States, population growth is still in the suburban areas and in places that are less dense and less Black. So, I think, just to kind of highlight some of the ways that I've been looking at this, it's important, I think, with gentrification questions to kind of look at within metropolitan area percentiles, or just, and not kind of, look at, rising home values, just without kind of the context of the surrounding metropolitan area. And of course, like, 20 people are going to measure these things with 20 different indicators, but I think education, race, and income are often key to look at. So this is a busy slide, but basically what I have is 6 indicators here, and looking at kind of the best quartile, so the best 25th percentile for each of these incomes, or each of these indicators. So top income quartile, bottom poverty quartile. And the kind of the line that stands out in gray is a big growth in relative home values in Black neighborhoods in the 1980s that kind of stayed high throughout the last 30 years. And the other kind of biggest change is in kind of low poverty and high income neighborhoods. So you could look at this and say, well, it does seem like Black neighborhoods are getting, are seeing higher demand, seeing higher home values more quickly than they're seeing changes in other kind of socioeconomic characteristics. I think if we think about gentrification in terms of racial transition, there's a wee bit of evidence, I'd say, in my sample, looking back 50 years, that Black neighborhoods are racially transitioning more often. So from 1970 to 1980, 95% of the tracts that started the decade as Black neighborhoods ended the decade as Black neighborhoods. From 2000 to 2010, that was 90%. From 2010 to 2017, which is a smaller, period, that was 91%. So like Black neighborhoods stay Black in a very stable manner for the most part, but there's some bit of evidence that like this might be a faster occurring transition, and a lot of this has to do with racial change coming not just from white households, but from Hispanic households, who are if you look at the 1970 and 1980 Black neighborhoods and then follow them over time, Hispanics are very prevalent in these neighborhoods. And again, some of that is a lot of that is in places that are kind of typical immigrant destinations on the West Coast, Florida, Chicago, New York, stuff like that. I feel like I've made this point a couple times, but kind of to highlight this, conditions are worse in the Midwest Black neighborhoods, but they remain Black. They are best in the West, but their Black status is very fleeting. So that's kind of, this double-edged sword of declining Black neighborhoods in the places where they do the best. So I think this is something that I've been looking at a lot recently is looking at the characteristics of neighborhoods that kind of exit this Black status. So I call them exiters, going from being a Black plurality to not a Black plurality. And you do see neighborhood income changing very quickly in these neighborhoods. And so that again would kind of lead to some to think that a lot of this is something like gentrification. Poverty rates don't change that much. So this, I guess, tracks with a lot of research on gentrification and displacement, where, it seems like it's higher income people moving in rather than lower income people moving out. Not that that doesn't happen, because we can see right here that the poverty rates are changing, just not as rapidly as incomes. Okay, last thing I'll talk about is, so I did, actually create a gentrification kind of yes/no indicator. I can provide more details if you can't read the slide extremely fast or quickly. And generally, when I look at this, I find that Black neighborhoods are less likely to gentrify than high poverty neighborhoods, and about similarly likely to gentrify as Hispanic neighborhoods, which, a lot of the research to date on gentrification suggests that gentrification is more common in Hispanic neighborhoods in the US, and people are more hesitant to move into highly Black neighborhoods in the US. But looking at least in recent decades, I think it's very comparable between Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in terms of kind of, yes, they gentrified or no. And then I think a lot of the disappearing neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods that we're seeing in the West is, there's pretty strong evidence that is tied to gentrification. And, I could drive you to some places in Los Angeles where it would be pretty obvious. Okay, my man wants me to wrap it up. All right, let's go. So just to kind of reiterate, the findings that I'm at so far. So there's this story of kind of, a story of socioeconomic convergence with also a great amount of diversity in Black neighborhoods, sometimes more diversity than I think people appreciate in the literature. Black neighborhoods disappearing in the West, and not enough research, I think, out there on the American South, where the largest number of Black neighborhoods are and where it's growing the fastest. I want to learn more about DC and Atlanta because there's a lot promising there. And then gentrification is not the most common condition of black neighborhoods, but there is some evidence that the disappearance of black neighborhoods is kind of tied to that. I've got a lot more to do. I think there are ways that I'm working on to make this more explicitly spatial. The census tract is not the greatest way to look at some of these things. I talked about working on issues with mobility and actually tracking households in and out of these neighborhoods. There's a lot to do there. And I think this role of the regional economy and kind of looking at the gaps between black neighborhoods and non-black neighborhoods, there's a lot more to do there. So I'll stop there. I will thank you very much and look forward to conversation.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful stuff. Very, very interesting. I have lots of questions, but I expect other people do as well. So there's two ways of asking questions. One is you can type it directly into the chat box, or the other is that you put your hand up and I will call on you. So I will move. Should we just give people a moment to just put their hands up if they've got a question? We've got one, which I can't see. So Chico, you know the routine. You can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, Michael. Thanks a lot. That was really interesting. I also have lots of questions, but just two quickly not to take up too much time. One is, it's a nuanced picture that you showed, but I think if I have to sort of summarize, balance it out, it's mostly positive picture of sort of some convergence and so on and so forth. And that clashes with the overall view that we have about inequality in the US rising in almost every way. So I actually don't dispute your findings. I find them perfectly believable and really interesting, but two sort of questions as to whether you've done this or are thinking of doing them. One is looking as to whether, if you compare the whole distribution of income in black and non-black neighborhoods, is the picture changing as you go from the bottom to the top? So you had this interesting thing where there was some poverty convergence, but medians were not converging. Right? And I would hypothesize that 90th percentiles are diverging.
Right.
You see, and so I think it would be quite interesting to look at percentiles, just pick a few and see if the convergence is more a feature of the bottom than of the top. And the great increases in inequality in the US come from the top, and they presumably are more about white people becoming very rich. So even though you're not going to capture top incomes or anything in census data, it could still be interesting to show the sort of convergence at the bottom, divergence at the top, if it were there. The other advantage of that, just to say, is that as you I'm sure you know, poverty scholars, particularly those outside the United States, are just mesmerized by the fact that the US keeps the Molly-Orshansky poverty line of 1969 basically unchanged in supposed real terms from the CPI. So looking at quantiles will also be a little bit more of a relative metric. And my other sort of heterogeneity question, and this is really a question for you, I have no idea, but a hypothesis here is, what is the heterogeneity among black neighborhoods? If you plotted black neighborhoods median incomes as a density function, is there a spread out where you have, to use your DC examples, you have your sort of Shaw and Northeast DC getting a lot better, but your Anacostia not necessarily, and staying behind. And similarly, bits of Detroit will be staying behind, whereas bits of LA are moving forward. So is there a growth in inequality between black neighborhoods that you maybe haven't quite shown yet? I think you've hinted at it, but anyway, thanks.
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much. That question makes me think that I might have started like too elementary at the outset with kind of the basics of race in America, right? But so I think to answer your question a little, so I absolutely have dug a lot into ways of trying to, I think both of your questions are getting at like, how do you capture heterogeneity and inequality in a more nuanced way than I showed here. And, you know, I can very honestly say that I have toiled in those fields quite a lot with the data as best I could. And I didn't present any of that today, it just hit the cutting room floor. I think what I do know, what I do know and have taken away is that things don't look that different if you compare, say, averages versus comparing the 80th percentile, you know, whether it's income or poverty, or you look at the 20th percentile income or poverty. So like, it's not, the hypothesis that I wanted to kind of disprove was, okay, are there like a small or medium number of, you know, very high achieving Black neighborhoods that we didn't have in 1970 that we have now, that are changing, that are kind of contributing to this convergence in a disproportionate way? And I wouldn't say that that effect is zero, but it's not huge. And I think one of the reasons gets to your second question, which is that you know, I say there's diversity amongst Black neighborhoods. There's less diversity amongst Black neighborhoods than amongst non-Black neighborhoods. So, you know, the real heterogeneity in American neighborhoods is like, you know, it might be a white neighborhood. You know, it's you know, comparing Beverly Hills to, you know, somewhere in West Virginia or something, right? Like that is a massive wealth difference. And like I said, I mean, even if you look at Washington, D.C., and you look at the very highest achieving Black neighborhoods, like most of those neighborhoods are solidly middle class, maybe upper middle class, but they're not, you know, the median, so dollars, you know, they're not like Marylebone, you know, they're not Notting Hill, right? It's a totally different scale. So I do think it's really, really important to look at various, you know, kind of high and low quartiles, and I have a lot to say on that in the book, but I don't think it's a massive driver of kind of this relative convergence that we see.
Great, thank you. Who else has got questions? We've got about 5 minutes left. In that case, I will take advantage. So one thing you didn't talk much about, Michael, was policy, right? And in the UK, we've had this sort of fluctuating, you know, we've had fluctuating policy between sort of, you know, should we be sort of mixing up communities? Should we be not? You know, it'd be great if you'd say a little bit on that. And I'm also going to take a question from David. David Soskis has got his hand up as well. Maybe you can take both questions at the same time. I think we're running out of time. So David, you're on mute.
So I find that totally fascinating. And I deeply look forward to your book. I wonder, have you done any work on how crime has changed as a result of all this? What's very interesting is when you look at crime in very large cities in the States, it has the violent crime data has come down a lot, whereas the violent crime data in smaller places and towns and so on has gone up. It's very difficult, obviously, to match that up. It's only been done once to race, but I wonder whether that's something which you've thought about.
Yeah, so I think, you know, both of these questions are right in my, you know, my happiness sweet spot. And I think so first, the question on policy, you know, Neil, I mean, I plan to write a whole chapter on what we haven't done policy-wise, so I think that's one place to start, is that the United States has never really had like a coherent, durable urban policy. We had like a spasm of activity in the 1960s, and that's somewhere that's another kind of data point in this kind of 1970 as like this key moment. So we had a spasm of activity in the 1960s, but that changes quite rapidly in the 1970s and 1980s, where the kind of fleeting investments that we started to make in cities dried up, or shifted to more kind of market-oriented solutions. And so I think that's one piece of this story, is that we haven't really been coherent and really dogged about kind of here's what we would like to see in terms of urban outcomes or neighborhood outcomes, and here's how and let's do it this way. But then a more specific question that I think you were getting at, Neil, is like this idea of like intentionally integrating places, right? So I talked a little bit about the movement opportunity study in the United States, and so that was like our big effort to kind of produce this evidence base around using housing policy to integrate neighborhoods, or to take people from very racially concentrated and low income places and move them somewhere else and see, is that good for them? I think, the way I sit on where I lean on this right now is like, I think that sort of the way we've done that, it, puts a lot of the onus on the people who grow up in or live in these disadvantaged places, right? Like, that's kind of where housing policy went more often, was like, well, let's give people a ticket out. And first of all, that like, it's usually a drop in the bucket in terms of like numbers. Second, the outcomes haven't been like as dramatic as I think people would have thought in terms of like improving these people's lives. And third, like it lets, a lot of places off the hook in terms of, the more kind of fair housing side of this. So, we think of, so like giving like 5 families a ticket out and, and expecting that to be integration is crazy. It's like, there are these entire swaths of, suburban America where, we haven't allowed for integration on a larger scale. And so I think, I think that's, really the next frontier of a sensible integration policy in the US. On the crime side, I think the very swift increases in home values and kind of demand for people, the demand of a lot of younger professionals to live in big cities in the United States absolutely has a lot to do with the fact that it's a lot safer. And I think you're right that contrasts with some of the smaller kind of left behind metropolitan areas where crime didn't really go down all that much. Now we, of course, I think, this golden age of the great American crime decline is probably ending anyway. And you have kind of other drug issues that are changing, I think, though, those very kind of macro trends. And so I think, it's absolutely tied to this story, and the extent to which that holds is going to be very key in terms of what the Black neighborhood looks like in the future. And obviously like how residents, are kind of shaped by those environments and, are able to stay safe in those environments.
Wonderful. I think we're out of time unless anyone's got a sort of burning question. But I thought it was wonderful. We're looking forward to seeing the book. Maybe we'll have you, well, if you're around, we'd love to have you back to talk about the book when it's finished. Thank you so much for speaking to us virtually, and thank you all for attending. We have another seminar this time next week: Citizenship for Sale, Millionaires, Microestates and Mobility, which promises to be another fantastic one. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.